You're listening to the View+finders podcast from Framerate Technologies. I'm Vaughn Juares. I'm here with Sam McQueen, and we're talking about the importance of asset management. Sam, tell me, why does access to assets and management of assets, for example, film and television episodes and the content around them, why does that matter?
The big reason it matters is because when the transition was made from physical assets, reels of film, master tapes, etc., to digital, the vulnerability of those assets increased. Without those physical copies that you have, without tapes, without reels, without everything, yes, you can put those assets on a hard drive, which is typically how they're delivered, or you can put them in cloud storage. But if you don't have the proper redundancies put in place on those storage systems, drives fail, cloud storage gets moved or accidentally deleted, it is much, much easier now for you to lose the asset itself simply because it does not physically exist. Having a reel of film, you know exactly where it is. If it's stored properly, it's pretty easy to manage. If it's a digital asset and if it's not in the physical, tangible asset, it becomes much more vulnerable and much easier to lose.
I don't know that a lot of people understand this, but when a studio, for example, makes a film, what are the kind of assets that go into delivering that, and what assets are created in the making of a movie? I know everyone watches a film, they watch a movie, they see the sound and the pictures, they might have subtitles they're watching, but what are the real assets, and is it complex? Explain that to me.
Yes, it's incredibly complex. A single film from a major studio, you would expect to have worldwide distribution theatrically and then be available worldwide in terms of being able to get it digitally, but also a physical copy. So going back to the theatrical side, the studio has to deliver multiple versions of that specific film. They have to deliver it, obviously, in English for English-speaking markets, but then in every single other language and territory that they exhibit the movie in, whether it's Spanish, Japanese, Portuguese, Russian, French, etc., every single one of those territories is its own specific asset. Multiply the total number of languages that a major film would be released, and that's where it sits simply theatrically. Then the same thing is true for delivering to platforms like iTunes and Google Play, multiple languages, multiple formats. Then with Blu-ray, just with one title, you could be looking at 50 to 60, sometimes even more assets surrounding just a single movie.
And that's not mentioning the cut-down versions for like airlines, corrections, television, PG-13 cut-downs, and the like. And so every time something's edited, it's a new subtitle title, it's a new audio track, potentially new video track. So you multiply that again by those markets. It's a huge number. But what happens? Okay, so say you have all these assets. They're at a big provider. You've watched a movie and you see Deluxe at the end. You know, Deluxe obviously had a huge library of stuff, still does. But what happens when a company like that goes bankrupt? I mean, when you're relying on some third-party company, what happens to those assets?
That's a very good question, and that's what creates, in a digital age, a new wave of lost media. I mean, people are very familiar with lost media from previous years and generations. For instance, the first few episodes of The Honeymooners were not saved. The film was not saved. But when it comes to now, from a digital perspective, it's all well and good to have a major company like Deluxe, for instance, handling all of these assets. When they go under, that becomes a question of not only where are my assets, but how do I get access to them? Is there operationally going to be a way in which I can ensure that all of my assets come back to me? You as the filmmaker, you as the owner of that content, you're sort of left in the lurch for a certain time. They may end up being another form of lost media unless you can ensure that you've got your own copy.
So the stakes aren't just, I lost my movie, but you could actually be losing history if you lose movies.
Precisely. If the last copy of a digital asset accidentally gets deleted, it no longer exists.
I know at Framerate Technologies we have systems to actually manage and deal with this very issue of assets and quality control. So could you just explain what the systems are that we use and how that prevents a lot of these issues?
Absolutely. So we built and developed a system which we called Command, which is our digital asset manager. And what Command allows for Framerate to have a copy of an asset for a content provider's films, movies, television, etc. But it also allows the content owners to have access to their assets in our system as well. We always encourage every single content provider to have a robust redundancy backup on their end, but we also provide them, the content owners, access to say, look, you have access to your titles in our system. We want to make sure that there is not a need to go through Framerate for a content owner to access their content. Obviously, on the other side, where we come in as gatekeepers is allowing the assets to be shared with third parties, where we have a system of permissions where the only time that a platform or another third party would be shared with a library or a piece of content is if we enable that to happen. But for the owners of the content, we say, look, you always have access to your assets. You may need them. Something may happen on your end. Asset retention, asset availability is something that's very important to us, and we designed Command specifically around those two components.
I guess if anybody listening has questions about that, we can reach out to Framerate Technologies and get a tour of Command. Well, you've been listening to the View+finders podcast from Framerate. Thanks for listening.